Feature mapping is similar to example mapping, but it focuses more on the alternative paths through the story to identify as many significant examples as possible. Feature mapping builds on example mapping and adds some new concepts. You could think of feature mapping in terms of 4 principles. First of all, rules explain examples and examples illustrate rules. But then we take examples a little bit further and we say that steps explore examples and we have questions to challenge everything. Let's see how this works out in practice. Here's our story from the previous session. How would we analyze the refund cancelled orders story using feature mapping? First of all, we start with an anchoring example. Anchoring examples are detailed concrete narratives of one user's journey through the system. The anchoring example is mainly used as a conversation starter to get people thinking about the different variations that might happen. Here, for example, we've got an anchoring example that reads like this. Sarah leaves her apartment and orders her usual morning latte. She's 30 minutes away from Barry's coffee shop, but 5 minutes later, when she reaches the tube station, she realizes that she needs to go to a different office and won't be going to Barry's coffee shop after all. So she cancels her order. She paid by credit card and the refund is repaid directly onto her card. The first thing we do now is to lay out our rules. Just like with example mapping, we start with the rules that we know about. So our one rule might be that orders cancelled less than 5 minutes before pickup time incur a $1 fee. And then we look for examples around these rules. Let's think, what could you come up with as an example for this particular scenario? We might think of one like this, the one where Sarah has to cancel her order, but she's got time to spare. Now we think about how this example would play out. How would we break it down into the steps or activities that happen for Sarah and for Barry, and for the outcomes that we're expecting? We call these the steps and the consequences. We're looking really in more detail at the actual user journey and looking at the flow through the story and the consequences that we're interested in. The first step might be simply Sarah orders her coffee when she's 30 minutes from the store. We use yellow cards here, primarily because there's only so many coloured cards in the pack. You don't really need to be very dogmatic about the colours, but it is nice to be consistent so that people can recognise what a particular card means in a particular context. So our first step is Sarah orders her coffee when she's 30 minutes from the shop. And our next step might be, well, Sarah cancels the order when she's 25 minutes away. So that's Sarah's tasks done. Now what happens? We're interested in the outcomes. What are the consequences of these actions that we expect to happen? We mark the consequences with orange cards. Our first consequence is that we expect Sarah to be fully refunded. So we put that next to our step tasks, our step cards. But that's not all. We also have a consequence for Barry. For Barry, we want the order to be removed from Barry's list. It's always important to think about all of the consequences for each scenario that we're looking at. And that's one thing feature mapping does very well. Now we have our full flow through the scenario. When Sarah orders her coffee with time, and she cancels with time to spare. So she orders her coffee and she cancels 25 minutes from the store. So she gets refunded and the order gets removed. Our next step is to hunt for variants. Feature mapping is a really flexible approach and it encourages us to explore our requirements in all sorts of different directions. Before we start, let's recap on the cards that we have. First of all, we have our blue cards, which are our rules. Now, to illustrate our rules, we have examples. And and we break down our examples into steps. At the end of an example, we want to find out what we expect, so we have consequences, which are the orange cards. Now, when we explore our variations, we want to look at each step and consequence and think, what else could happen here? What other outcome might occur? This is how we hunt for assumptions, look for uncertainty, and explore alternative cases, including negative cases. For example, what happens if Sarah cancels when she's 2 minutes away? Let's explore this option. First of all, we add another card. Sarah cancels the order 2 minutes away from the shop, and we place it underneath the step. What are the consequences of this change? How does this affect the outcomes? If the consequences are the same, it might not be a very interesting example, because we're really interested in primarily in the variations that have different outcomes. So in this case, Sarah gets charged $1. And we put this under the corresponding consequence card. So now, we've just discovered a new example. Let's give it a name. The one where Sarah has to cancel at the last minute. We might draw some lines to make the flow more obvious. So now we have two examples. One where Sarah orders on time and one where she cancels at the last minute. And we can see both have slightly different flows and slightly different outcomes. Like example mapping, feature mapping has questions. We can ask questions about different things in the flow when we're not sure. For example, we might have the same question we had with example mapping. How does the fee work if the customer pays using his loyalty points? We often put the question underneath the consequence or step that it relates to, so that we can understand the context a little bit better. Feature mapping really encourages us to look at different variations of the flow, different variations of the scenarios, and even different variations of the rules. Sometimes the rule itself is just a specific case of a more general business rule. For example, in this case, our rule is orders cancelled less than 5 minutes away incur a $1 pickup fee. We could challenge this rule and say, well, can you give me an example of a time when we don't charge this fee? And this might make us think, oh yes, premium customers are only charged 50 cents. So we've just discovered another rule. We can put this rule underneath the first one, and we can generalize or extrapolate a more general rule or a guideline, such as orders cancelled less than 5 minutes before the pickup time incur a cancellation fee of some kind. We call these guidelines because they're a little bit more high level than the rules. And we can place them to the left of our rules, a little bit like a section heading in the document. This helps us group the rules more clearly. Can you imagine what cards we'd put on this new line? What example could you give for premium members are only charged a 50 cent fee? Maybe something like this. The one where Petra, the premium member, has to cancel at the last minute. So Petra orders her coffee, she cancels when she's 2 minutes away, and she only gets charged a 50-cent fee. And Barry sees that his order is removed, as in their previous examples. Sometimes when we do feature mapping, we realise that the story is bigger than we thought. And one of the nice things about feature mapping is it makes it really easy to break our stories into smaller chunks, where each chunk still delivers a piece of business value. Because in fact, each rule represents business value. For instance, we could decide to only handle the $1 fee for everyone in the first iteration and see how the customer likes it, and then handle premium customers in a second iteration. We could split this feature very simply by drawing a horizontal line across the board and only doing the rules in the top section, leaving the rules in the bottom section for later on. Feature mapping, like example mapping, is designed to help you find the examples that lead to your automated acceptance criteria. And feature mapping has an added bonus that makes it easy to go from a feature map to well-structured cucumber scenarios. In fact, each stage of a feature map can become part of a gherkin scenario. This makes it much easier to build well-written, nice high-level gherkin scenarios that are easy to understand by the business and relate to the conversations we had in the Three Amigos session. Here, for example, we have the order, the high-level rule or guideline, which maps to our feature name. Then we have the actual rule, which we've recorded as a text underneath the feature. Our example maps to our scenario heading. And then each step maps to a given when or then state. So we can see Sarah orders her coffee is a given Sarah has ordered her coffee. When is the action? Sarah cancels the order 25 minutes from the shop. And the outcomes other than the consequences. Sarah should be fully refunded and the order should be removed from Barry's order list. Both feature mapping and example mapping are great techniques that help you get a better understanding of requirements faster and more thoroughly. You might use either during a Three Amigos session, depending on the complexity of the story and how well it's understood. You might even start with example mapping and then switch to feature mapping as you realize you'd like to go into more detail about the flow and the consequences. But both are really aimed at focusing on the business domain, rather than getting bogged down in cucumber syntax too early and losing the attention of the business people. And it's a great way to speed up your Three Amigos session and make them more productive.